lots of things going on in our world, certainly, and some new news each and every week. So we wanted to just get going here this morning, or afternoon, I guess. Geez. I'm John Whitler with Ogallala Commons and Grow Seco. And let's see, let's go to the next slide. Wanted to make sure that we give a thank you to the sponsors. We appreciate that and the support that we've been getting to bring this information to everybody. And we can move on to the next slide. Today we're going to be talking mainly about ag. First of all, from a policy and economic standpoint, with Don Thilmany, and then we've got Sean Martini joining from Farm Bureau to talk about ag with a little bit of just an industry and market perspective. So then from there, we'll wrap up with some question and answer. I wanted to make sure and acknowledge here at the beginning of our call the news yesterday and the announcement from the SBA that the funds, the initial nearly 350 billion that was allotted to the payroll protection program, those funds have been exhausted at the moment, but everyone who has applied is still in the queue, and they're looking at certainly whether there'll be another round of that coming. And then also with the Int'l, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, it is also not accepting new applications at the moment, but we'll continue to process those in the order that they were received as well. So just want to acknowledge that and also let everybody know that we've got Mickey on the phone from the Southeast Economic Development Corporation, and we wanted to make sure that she'll be available during the question and answer throughout to kind of field some questions on that, and then we'll circle back to the question and answer at the end as well. So anyway, just those couple of announcements. We thank you for joining us, and I want to just kind of get right into it and pass it over to Don Thilmany, and I'll turn it over to you, Don, and you can take it from here. We've got Don on. She might still be on mute, so we can go ahead and turn over the next slide while Don is coming on with us. Don has been working with a group out of CSU. She's the Associate Director in the Office of Communications and Economic Development, Professor of Ag and Resource Economics. And they've just got done publishing a policy piece, I know, and going to be breaking that down a little bit and talking about some Southeast specific items. So are you with us and ready, Don? We've got your video, but we still got your audio on mute, it looks like. Oh, I heard you for a second. All right. Appreciate everybody hanging with us for a minute while we get this figured out. While we're figuring that out, you can just jump in, Don, whenever you get that figured out. I wanted to remind everybody that we'll be sending out there'll be the link to download all of the slides from today, as well as a link to the recording that will be sent out afterwards. Let's see. Do we have a sound check with Dawn yet? Not yet. Let's see. Maybe what we should do is just jump over to Sean Martini with Farm Bureau and have Sean talk a little bit through his information, or do we?
I think I'm ready to.
We have you.
Okay.
All right, we've got you. You got it.
Yeah.
Take it from here. All right. I'm not sure what is going on there, Dawn. I can see that you're talking, but I can't hear you anymore. Let's give it another. Maybe we should see if you could just join us back on computer audio, or try that, and we'll maybe just jump ahead in the slides to Sean if you're ready to go, Sean.
I'm here if it's working by
Oh,
computer. I'm glad
you are here.
Yeah, well, I usually do it by computer, and so I'm happy to do it this way if you feel the quality is good enough. So let's go ahead to slides if you're hearing me okay.
Yep, Don, we're hearing you. Thank you.
Great. So sorry for all of that patience. I'm here to give you an overview of a couple things I've been doing and to give you a broader stance on how it may tell the story of what's going on in the broader agriculture. As you heard in my introduction, I've been a professor at CSU for quite a few years. And when I took an extension role with that program, they had me start developing a CSU food systems team. And more recently, I helped establish a regional economic development institute. So I'm kind of squarely in the center of how economic development, food, and agriculture are playing out in our state. And because of some work I've done at the national level, I got asked when the COVID event started occurring about a month ago, and USDA was starting to map out some of the potential policy solutions to weigh in on some ways to think about who's being impacted. So today I want to give you an overview of work I did with Becca Jablonski, but also who's a colleague here at CSU, but also a few other colleagues across the country as we put this together. And even though it was about local and regional food markets, I'll give you the broader context about why it helps tell the bigger story of what's going on in ag. So next slide. So in addition to looking at some of the initial estimates we made for impacts on the local and regional Colorado ag food system, I want to talk a little bit today about a broader look about how we see this kind of resonating through other aspects of the Colorado ag system. And we thought it was a really good time to revisit the Colorado Blueprint for Food and Agriculture we developed with communities about 2 years ago in partnership with the Colorado Department of Agriculture, because some of those regional priorities that were lined up at that time may be worth revisiting right now because of what's going on. Then I kind of want to end the call with kind of what I see happening in the policy front. I was actually hoping there might be answers today to share with you, but give you some calls to action and some things to keep your eyes out for in the next couple of days and weeks. Go ahead. You advance the slide. So this is the report, and I'm not going to walk you through it, but on the left-hand side is the report we did at the national level to help guide some of the, again, CARES package that came to agriculture. But then we went ahead and took that same report, and on the left-hand side, reworked the numbers for just Colorado. And as you can see, we found some pretty significant numbers, and this was just among the subset of the farm and ranching community who had noted that they were working and specifically selling with a target towards local and regional markets. And that's actually a relatively small part of the population. But an interesting thing we did there, which ended up flavoring some of the support that probably newly will be coming to the dairy and livestock industries as well, is it made them realize really part of how they should be looking at This is just like a trade disruption like we have when we have trade disruption, trade wars and trade disagreements, is looking at how different marketing channels are being impacted. And so if you read through that report, even though the reports are only about those segments of producers who are in local and regional markets, a very similar thought process is being used as they think about who's being the most impacted by putting it into the context of what marketing channels different sectors of agriculture are dependent on. So next slide. So in the context of local and food markets, as an example of one of the markets we talked about being impacted, is without it being, you know, we really only want to support impacts that were because a producer was doing exactly the right thing, being a savvy business manager, but something came up that disrupted their business that was no power of their own. And so restaurants and universities are two examples of two markets for food and beverages that almost completely dried up, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because of this event. And so any agriculture or food producer who was dependent on those particular markets had their marketing channels significantly disrupted, just like would happen if we had a trade disagreement. So this is an example of how we estimated those numbers for those farmers who were specifically noting that they marketed to restaurants and universities. But again, the same context is how the USDA now is thinking about which sectors are being the most impacted by this event. Next slide. So let's look at this in a little bigger context. The Colorado Department of Ag has a great map that kind of shows the dependency by county of where agriculture resides in the state. And as you can see, there are a lot of cattle and cows on there. So we know livestock and dairy is actually a really big industry for us. So beyond those local and regional market impacts that we estimated, we just had a colleague out at Oklahoma State put out some really interesting estimates this week of what's going to happen more broadly to the beef industry, probably because of this event. And again, this is a nationwide estimate, not a Colorado estimate. I just felt it was worth sharing with you because as you can see from the map, cattle is something that's the most ubiquitously found across the state. And so we, number one, know they're going to be disrupted. And the good news is that the way I'm seeing policy being framed, it's very likely that those beef producers who aren't typically first in line for getting assistance when we have economic events that influence ag, in this case, will be taken care of better. Next slide. So in the Colorado Blueprint for Food and Agriculture, we used a combination of a survey we did of Colorado citizens, data analysis from what's going on economically with our sectors, and a series of town halls we held throughout the state to look at some of the cross-cutting opportunities that we saw as a state were available for us to take advantage of. The only reason I'm revisiting those today is for you to know that that resource is out there. And if you Google it, you can easily find it. Looks like the slide is a little cut off here, but these are also some priorities that I think are going to be particularly important for us to revisit as we find a pathway to recovery for this event, because a lot of them are going to be opportunities, I think, that are going to be newly framed because of the events we just have seen happen, and how we're going to see things may have to pivot or change a little bit as we move forward. Next slide. For instance, this would be an example of one of the, I think we have 83 figures and charts in that program. Keep hitting the arrows so that we see the whole slide, if that's okay. We try to map out every part of the food supply chain. So for instance, retail food in Colorado in 2016 represented about $33 billion in economic activity. Of that, about 13 billion of it was food at home and 14 billion of it was food away from home. The reason I highlighted these numbers of all the charts I could have looked at is, as we all know, that food away from home has not come to a screeching halt, but has gone down somewhere. Our estimates are 75% in the last month. That's again one of those significant market channel disruptions that we try to help the USDA envision as they were framing who is the most impacted and what sectors might feel the brunt of this event the most. And particularly the 7.2 billion that were full service restaurant partners are the ones most significantly hit. Some of those fast food and fast casual and delivery options have fared this a little bit better just because even with distancing, they've been able to do their more normal operations. But again, this is also just something to highlight. You want to know about the size of any different part of the ag sector, that report did a good job of overviewing it. Nice. Next slide. Also, one thing you might want to know about is there are actually data products out there you might not know about. This is one that we found where cell phone data is actually being tracked. But I bring it up because I wanted to highlight that you can see the significant downturn in sit-down restaurant traffic over the last month or so. And it is, again, down at counter service restaurants like fast food as well, but not as significantly. These are, again, since we don't have the economic data yet, are ways to make the best estimates of how big of a disruption we've had in the market channels that some of our producers and food manufacturers have been facing. Next slide. As a part of that Colorado Blueprint for Food and Agriculture, I just also wanted to highlight that we visited all of the different regions of the state. Actually, this is a smaller region than we're talking with today because we separated our regions into 10 regions. But in those, we held town hall events where we came up with some of those priorities you saw earlier. But this is one particular where we had some discussions after noting some of the key challenges and opportunities for the region, and including the fact in this case that we had a high export orientation out of that region, which again, depending on how long and significantly the trade relationships and flows occur, that's where we don't know how to predict how big this disruption is going to be. But with regions with a high export orientation, it's likely to be more significant, and the Southeast found that to be true. Next slide. So I also wanted to alert you to the fact that this is actually a particular issue where there's fairly strong bipartisan support, similar to the small business development programs that we started the conversation with today, that have already been had their resources expended because there was such high need. This is also a policy platform that we have bipartisan support on in our state, in addition to our governor and commissioner in ag already putting out a signal of support. Both Bennett and Gardner put out a press release this week, and you can see the buckets of disaster relief they're asking for. And they very much mimic some of the things I've already alluded to, in the fact that they want livestock producers to get a stronger level of support than they traditionally do, a focus on small and mid-sized farms who have been using those alternative marketing channels because they're not quite large enough to be getting onto the retail storefront shelves that the bigger producers have access to. Assistance for dairy farmers, because again, when those restaurants and schools closed down, there was a lot of milk that was destined for those markets that all of a sudden didn't have a place to go. Fruit and vegetable losses, this isn't for weather events, although this week that's what you'd want to think about. But instead, again, we had some people getting into season extension and who've been storing products so it was available for wholesale markets that have dried up. And then obviously just prioritizing doing the outreach and accessibility and technical assistance with folks so they know how to get access to those funds. Next slide. So it's nice to see our political delegation seeing all of this in the same light. So our call to action for you guys is to keep actively communicating your stories. How is this impacting your operations or food businesses in your community? That seems to be flavoring how some policy at least is being shaped. We had no idea when we just gave our advice on something that they would actually use it to think more creatively about how former food systems, food and ag support programs could be reframed to be more effective. Again, as a region, you need to think about the opportunity to strategically reposition your farms, your food businesses, and that whole sector, so they're both more resilient and maybe able to take advantage of how markets are likely to move. We are going to see an economic downturn, but what we do know is ag tends to be countercyclical. Once we come out of the most acute part of these events, people are going to still be spending money on food, but we've already kind of forced their hand to make them think a little differently about how they might procure that food, and there may be opportunities to take advantage of. So be looking for ways to create new linkages, not just within your region, but your region has the ability to raise and produce a lot of food, and Denver metro area does not, but they will be looking for resilient, stable, secure sources of food for their population. And so this is the time to have those discussions about how you get a better reach into those markets. So with that, I'll wrap up, and sorry again for the technical difficulties at the start.
Oh, no problem whatsoever. Thanks, Don. We'll make sure that we have your contact information as well that will go out with the follow-up, and we're going to be taking Q&A at the end. And so I would just encourage anyone that's on to put any of the questions that you have in the Q&A forum for any of our panelists, so that we can kind of organize those and be ready here in a few minutes to tackle those. So with that, I am going to just go ahead and turn it over to Sean Martini, who's the VP of Advocacy for Farm Bureau, and we'll see what Sean has to tell us. It's all yours.
Okay. Can you hear me okay, John?
Oh, yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for the opportunity to come on and talk to folks today. My presentation, what I have to talk about, and what Don just mentioned will overlap slightly, but maybe come at it from a little bit different of an angle. I'll include a little bit more policy perspective from what we've seen from the start of the shutdown and as it pertains to COVID-19. And I can start out by mentioning, everybody on this call knows agriculture is a critical industry, and it was identified by the state early on as such. And we give a lot of credit to Governor Polis with the way he constructed the executive orders to leave as much flexibility as possible, so that not only farms and ranches, food processors and the like, people who are directly involved in production agriculture, but also their suppliers had clear direction that they were able to keep going and keep producing, keep those businesses open, and supply farmers and ranchers and agricultural businesses with the tools that they need to continue producing food, fiber, and fuel in eastern Colorado and around the country, or around the state. We've heard from a lot of additional Farm Bureau staff in other parts of the country, particularly Wisconsin, some of the other upper Midwest states, and Ohio and the like, that those suppliers were not given the same leeway to the executive orders that those governors instituted, and it caused some significant difficulty for producers here at the early part of the year when they really needed some of the critical supplies and inputs that they typically have access to. So we're really glad that we didn't have that trouble in Colorado agriculture, specifically outside of a few items here and there. But outside of that, business is not going on as usual in farm country, just as a result of the measures that we've had to put in place to keep producers safe, keep rural communities safe, so that we don't have an outbreak and we can keep people with their boots on in the field, continuing to farm and ranch. And then subsequently to the initial discussions about what lockdowns were going to look like and the like, we've really had a lot of problems with knock-on effects of COVID-19, and it's significantly impacted the agriculture industry, as Don had mentioned, maybe a little bit more than all of us had initially thought at the start. We all know that there's not a supply problem in agriculture and food, and that the empty grocery shelves and things like that folks have seen, particularly along the Front Range and in major urban centers around the country, is specifically a result of a demand problem. There's a significant demand crunch when you had a lot of panic buying, as we've all seen with toilet paper and the like, but that played itself out in other fresh products like beef and pork and other proteins, eggs, milk, and in some aisles, flour, baking supplies and the like. And that really caused major dislocations that are now playing themselves out on the other side of the market, upstream from the retail counter. In addition to that panic buying, as Don had mentioned, a significant percentage of our food purchases have transitioned from restaurant and food service now to the grocery store. In fact, prior to the shutdowns in the middle of March, I guess it was, Americans bought about 48% of their food from a grocery store, and that is now upwards of 90%. And that causes significant stress on the food supply chain as processors and manufacturers have to reorientate their supply chains and completely change the types of products they produce, the way they package it, and the way they get it to the consumer, away from restaurant and food service and towards the retail customer. And that's what's caused a lot of the problems as it pertains to folks seeing shortages in the grocery shelf, but it's also now causing huge supply pools with dairy, and it's starting to inch its way into the beef market and other markets as well. Here in Colorado, we are lucky in that our dairy industry has not had to start dumping milk as of yet. We credit Leprino Foods there in Greeley with a lot of that. They're a huge demand center that a lot of the other upper Midwest and dairy-heavy states do not necessarily have, and that's where we've seen a lot of the milk dumping, just because of so much of a drop in demand from food services, school lunch programs, and the like, particularly for dairy. So that is a plus, but that does not mean dairy prices are not under significant stress, and they have been for some time, even prior to the COVID-19 crisis. Same problem for beef. It's Colorado's largest commodity. Dairy is the second largest commodity overall. They represent about 3.7 billion in receipts into the state of Colorado. Cattle prices are off about 24% since the middle of January for live cattle. And there are a number of factors there. COVID-19 is certainly one of them, as people bought at the retail meat case, and now there's compression in that supply chain. And now we have a significant challenge with the closure of JBS and Greeley, other plants around the country that process not only beef, but other plants that are focused on pork. Smithfield has at least 10% of the country's pork production right now is offline as a result of COVID-19. Here in Colorado, we're hoping JBS can get up and running as soon as possible. I think the number I heard was that is about 6% of the country's beef processing capacity, and obviously critical for the eastern region of Colorado and other neighboring states as a demand center for live cattle that are fed here in the state and that are grown on the ranches all around the state. One of the positives there is, of course, the Cargill plant in Fort Morgan was allowed to remain open. They worked really hard to ensure that, in fact, their workers were protected to the extent they could possibly be. In the Northeast Colorado Department of Health didn't give them a clean bill of health, but came up with the determination that they were in fact protecting workers and protecting the food supply chain, and were a critical link in the industry there in that part of the state. And of course, they will continue to operate. So that is a plus. We really dodged a bullet with not having both of the plants in the state down currently. Commodities further up the supply chain, corn and wheat and others, are also down, anywhere between 3 and 25% here over the last couple of months. And of course, we're starting to see a lot of that play itself out and ripple through the ag economy when we've had the kind of pressure that we've had both in beef and dairy. Again, for Eastern Colorado in particular, we're really watching what's going on in the ethanol market. Problems there. We've got about 8 billion gallons across the country that are currently shut off. I don't believe we've had any plant closures here in Colorado, but certainly ethanol producers around the country are under extreme stress right now. And they're really getting hit with a 1-2 punch, both from a lack of demand on a volumetric basis because of stay-at-home orders that's requiring people to not drive and not use gasoline fuel that's blended with ethanol, but also because of the geopolitical issues with the OPEC oil cartel and its price war with Russia, coupled with a lack of demand for gasoline domestically here and around the world. That's pushed prices for gasoline on the wholesale level below that of a gallon of ethanol. And so there's really zero incentive for producers, gasoline manufacturers to blend any additional product then they're absolutely required to. It's pretty much just for the level of oxygenation that they need in order to get that into the fuel and have the fuel meet air quality requirements. And so the knock-on effects of plant closures, either here in Colorado or anywhere around the country, are really significant for our small rural communities. As I'm sure everybody on this call knows, they're a significant center of employment. They're a demand center for corn, and they can also cause problems when those plants shut down, when they no longer start to produce DDGs, dry distillers grains, or wet distillers grains that is used as a feedstock for cattle feeding and livestock feeding nearby that plant. So producers are now having to look for additional ways to balance their ration with not having that in order to supplement their feed. I can move away from that briefly, talk about a few of the bright spots that we see as potentially being a help or a tailwind to the industry going forward. Most of that is related to international trade. We've got the phase 1 agreement with China, which was just instituted, and then China was essentially taken offline because of the COVID-19 crisis. They've had some serious dislocations in their agricultural industry because the movement of people was so restricted between different provinces in the country. People couldn't get to work even if they wanted to, and so there is going to be a lot of pent-up demand for agricultural purchases in China that, lucky enough, they have committed to purchasing from the United States as a result of their phase 1 trade agreement with the Trump administration. So as they start to come online, and I believe I read this morning that the lockdown in Wuhan particularly is now been lifted, at least in some form. So we're hopeful that they can get back to business as much as normal as possible and start increasing their commodity purchases that they've committed to under that trade agreement, and that they will need as a result of a significant amount of agriculture production being taken offline there. Also, we've got the USMCA agreement that both Canada and Mexico have ratified. The United States has ratified it as well, and they're currently working. We're the last partner in the three-country agreement that is working on the legal implementation of the measure, and we expect that to be put into force by July 1. If it gets kicked down the road any further, it'll probably be early fall when that agreement gets completely put into force. But the ability for that to provide some certainty for our markets and our futures markets, particularly people who are trading commodities, have a little bit of certainty in knowing that we in fact do have duty-free access into our number 1 and number 2 largest agricultural trading partners. That will be certainly a help to future prices as we start to claw our way out of this current lockdown that we're in. And then I'd mention as well, particularly for the beef industry, exports prior to being shut down as a result of COVID-19 in 2020 were up anywhere between 10 and 53%, depending on, for beef star, it was 10%, 53% for pork, which is, of course, is not a huge commodity here in Colorado. We've got a little production in the eastern part of the state, but to the extent that demand center for corn grain can be brought back up into place through strong export markets, we think that is a good thing. We expect that demand to come back fairly quickly. Been working with our partners at U.S. Meat Export Federation to do a lot of education for consumers in the Asian countries that had been the real center for that increase in demand. That's also been extremely high value cuts as well. So as they start to come back online several weeks earlier than this country does, we're hopeful that food service and restaurant purchases can really start to drive demand for those higher value cuts that really drive up the value of our carcasses here, prior to us coming back online and having the restaurant demand start to come back here in this country and in Colorado specifically. The Asian markets are a few weeks ahead of us in the cycle of all of this. From a policy perspective, we're now working with folks in the Senate and the House on the next phase of economic stimulus. Of course, the Paycheck Protection Program and several of the emergency programs that were included in the CARES Act were a significant help. There was difficulty in terms of the Department of Treasury's rollout and rulemaking as it pertained to that bill initially for agriculture that put us 10 to 12 days behind the rest of the country. And that was unfortunate. They moved I think, as quickly as they can to sort of fix those problems. And Colorado's congressional delegation was very helpful in that. We expect that rollout and additional funds that are put into those programs in the next round of stimulus to be a little bit more flexible for rural Colorado in particular, and not just our producers and people who are applying for those funds, but the lending institutions, our community and regional banks that have access. In the initial program, you had Bank of Colorado and the other small community banks that work here in Colorado that service a lot of our people, competing for PPP dollars with the likes of Wells Fargo and Chase and others, and they simply don't have the staff and the resources and the firepower to be able to compete. So we're working with the delegation, hopefully, to wall off a certain segment of those future funds specifically for those small and intermediate-sized institutions so that they can be better positioned to help our producers and our small businessmen in rural Colorado be successful in getting those funds going forward and have a little bit better of a shot. So with that, I can wrap up and turn it back over to John. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Sean. I've got a couple of different questions to follow up with you and Don. So I think first, just in that, to tag on to that last piece that you were talking about, and same question will come to you, Don, as well. But for producers who are looking at their short-term future, what should they be considering in order to be ready? It seems like everyone is talking about the next round of stimulus, not if, but when and what. And so I'm curious if you could give everybody an idea of how they could be preparing now, to take part in that.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
What we've heard from our banking partners, Farm Bureau Bank, that's a partner institution for us, as well as our folks at the Colorado Bankers Association and independent bankers and others, is most lenders will continue to work with you, even if you were not able to get your application in and have dollars allocated to you through the CARES Act. The next phase of stimulus is coming in some form or fashion. So most lenders will take applications, get those put together. We've got good lessons learned now that most of the institutions have to make you be in the best position possible to be successful when the next tranche of funding comes through. But those applications can be done and completed and held, and SBA is holding them as well and won't process them until we get clarity from Congress, additional funding, and any changes to rulemaking that might be pursuant to that next bill that comes out of Congress. But they're still wanting to take those applications and get them ready to go for when the starting gun starts again on the next round.
Excellent, thanks. Don, you have something to add into that?
Well, Sean did a good job of that overview. I agree with him that we just had the big lenders and people who knew how to address these programs in a much better position to act quickly, because this has not even been a set of programs that have been usually thought of in the food and ag community. The ones already mentioned by Sean, and we know our producers and food companies are trying to keep their workers on board. We haven't seen the unemployment insurance relief be expended like small business. So the only reason that might be useful for the food and ag community is, at least on my farm back in Iowa, we did a lot of custom harvesting and had some work we did as contract work outside of our farm. And so if people are not aware of that, if you are doing some of that contract work and some of that has dried up, whether it's custom harvesting, custom baling, you have your own marketing firm where you're helping, or you're doing seed sales and you have that as a separate LLC independent, or you are a non-employer establishment, you also may be eligible on the contracting part of your life for some of the uninsurance programs. Unemployment insurance, for the first time since I've been around, had gig workers or contract workers that were, and so you think of that as things where you file a 1099 instead of a through your formal business taxes. You may, if you had some of your impact from this go through some of those contract work engagements drawing up, you may still be eligible as well too. But again, there hasn't been complete clarity there because this is a unprecedented offer to cover people who have not normally paid into unemployment insurance. And finally, Sean, I guess I'd like to hear your opinion on, you know, we're talking about the relief programs food and agriculture usually doesn't touch as much, but we also still have not seen how the programs are going to roll out in agriculture. It's been a little slower to announce exactly how those payments will be made. But again, if you have a good relationship with your FSA office, it's time to, like, you know, maybe start checking base to, you know, because I think that's going to be out soon. Like I was hearing this week, but now I guess it must be next week. But also, if you have people in your community, you know, who have not typically been in the circle with FSA because they've not qualified for that particular set of programs, but you know they're filling out a census and you know they have themselves classified in some way, shape, or form as a farm, you may want to alert them to the fact that there's going to be some news announced about relief programs, again, that are flowing to circles of agriculture that have not normally seen those. So it might be kind of even a promotion and awareness program just to make sure the full circle of people who could get relief know about even what's still coming even before there's a new CARES Act. Sean, do you know more about anything in that space?
You know, nothing hard and fast, a lot of rumor. I think the support is going to be fairly broad. And you mentioned earlier, there's definitely going to be a premium put on making sure that livestock and dairy producers are taken care of. There's probably going to be a significant amount of purchasing through Section 32 purchases for fresh products, fruits and vegetables and the like that could potentially be perishable. I know the Ag Department is also trying to work with farmers who are growing commodities that they're currently having to dump vegetables and fruits and the like, even outside of dairy, and try and put together some sort of a voucher program or something that can quickly get those products into the hands of food banks and regional food banks and the World Food Bank and the like. But I'd also say, you know, that I think a lot of this is stemming from the fact that there was very little guidance given from Congress as to how this money should be allocated. And that's why you've seen both the letters from our organization and other organizations, both Senators Bennett and Gardner, on trying to guide the Secretary's thinking and the Ag Department's thinking on what they're going to do with the additional spending authority that they were given. And as a result, that's slowed the process down in a sense. It wasn't done on the front end through legislative proceedings. It's now being done on the back end through rulemaking. And so there's a slight bit of a delay there. But I'm with you. We expect that at least to have the broad strokes of that policy public here at the early part of next week. And then we feel money should start flowing pretty quickly afterwards. And I think a lot of it, to your point about FSA, is going to flow through the existing programs and the existing relationships that producers have with FSA. So in a sense, a lot of this is going to be the ag specific programs are going to be a lot more automatic in a sense than the time and effort and the work that it took for producers specifically to apply for PPP and the emergency programs that came through the CARES Act outside of USDA.
All right, great. Well, thank you guys. I also wanted to bring on Mickey from the SBDC and ask her to certainly as well as ag producers, we also have a lot of small businesses that are dependent on ag producers and dependent on the ag economy. And so I'd like, Mickey, a couple of things. I got a couple of questions for you. First of all, just with the conversation just right here at the end, I'd love to have you respond to that. And then Tyann, we've got a question that had come in that I think goes really well with this as well, and that is that right as the PPP program exhausted the existing allocations of funds, was really when independent contractors, sole proprietors were really beginning to access those funds. And so what now, and what should those folks be doing in order to prepare for what's next? All right, I think we might have Mickey on mute.
Okay, try now. Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you are. Yeah, we got you. You got it.
Awesome. No feedback or anything?
Got a little bit of feedback, yes. If you have the audio on your computer, shutting that off might help.
I did.
Oh, well, maybe just if you don't mind using the, there should be the ability to chat to all the panelists and attendees, and I don't mind repeating some of that, or maybe one of the other panelists has, still has any magic that he wants to work on the back end there. But let's start, Mickey, with maybe just chatting in the chat box to everyone. And also a reminder to everybody that we will send follow-up in our follow-up emails as well.
John, one thing I might mention, we've talked to several of our producers who were successful in getting PPP funds. One of the things that was not as clear early on and became clear in subsequent rulemakings from the Treasury Department is those producers, in particular, the way their finances are set up, they don't pay themselves a salary necessarily. When the program was initially rolled out, it looked as though the money that they receive as a result of them running their operation would not be something that was replaceable or reportable through the program, because they were not technically paying themselves a salary. That's been wrapped up in the subsequent rulemakings, and you can still provide input to the SBA on what you think your compensation effectively is, even if it does not come in the form of reportable salary. So just for folks on the call or people who you're working with, that was really positive for those producers that are structured in a way that they don't necessarily pay themselves a paycheck.
All right, thank you. I do know Mickey gave the quick answer that. Hey, are you unmuted? This is the time to act as though the funding hasn't halted. So be putting together all of those things that you would have normally, and prepare as though it's here. And we'll be certainly having more information as they roll out more. Let's go ahead and move the slide forward as well. I also wanted to make sure and tell everybody about a couple of things. First of all, the Help Colorado Now Relief Fund, that is open for both nonprofit and for-profit. There's some relief there. And then we've also got this link for the alternative funding. A whole host of alternative funding sources have been coming forward. And one example that you would find on there is like Greenline Ventures, who has a emergency micro loan fund set up to help minority-owned and women-owned businesses to access some micro loans between $5,000 and $25,000 that will be at a fixed rate of 2% on the interest, and as well has about a 6-month no payment or no interest freeze. So there's lots of sources on that document. So we encourage you to check those out, and just continue to keep all of your options open. And I would encourage you as well, if you need to be accessing either the big name programs that are being announced and rolled out, or alternative funding sources, keep checking those as things change often. Keep your own running documents for some alternative sources. Now's the time to be resourceful and to pay attention to how things are changing. And then the last thing that I wanted to make sure and mention here before we end the call, also draw your attention to what Mickey was mentioning, is that if you've already got an application in before these funds were exhausted, that application still holds your point in line. It will still be processed, and as there's another wave of funding, you're already going to be in the queue. And so that's another reason, if you're thinking about pursuing this, to go ahead and have everything ready so that you'll be ready as everything unfolds. So I think with that, be watching for the follow-up, the video, and the follow-up emails. We'll link you to all of these resources, and we'll do this again next week. So thank you guys. We'll see you next time.